People on Maple Ridge barely noticed Miss Evelyn Carter. That's how she liked it. 72 years old, soft gray curls, cardigan buttons always lined up just right. She walked slow, spoke softer, and kept her eyes down like she didn't want trouble. Folks assumed she was fragile, confused, easy, that assumption. That was their first mistake. Miss Evelyn had lived in that apartment for 23 years. Same window, same hallway, same creaky floorboard by the sink that squeaked if you stepped wrong. She knew every sound that place made. What she didn't know, what nobody warned her about, was Derek. Derek was the new property manager. Mid-30s, slick haircut, cheap confidence. The kind of guy who talked at you instead of to you. He smiled with his mouth, not his eyes. First time Miss Evelyn met him, he didn't even sit down. Just stood there, tapping his pen, like her time didn't matter. "Rent system's changing," he said. "You'll need to pay online now." Miss Evelyn blinked once. "I've always paid in person." Derek shrugged. "Yeah, well, times change." She nodded, didn't argue, didn't complain. She simply reached into her purse, pulled out her rent receipt, dated, stamped, signed, and placed it gently on the desk. Derek barely glanced at it, pushed it back like it was nothing. 2 weeks later, she got a notice on her door. Late fee. 3 weeks later, another. By the end of the month, an eviction warning printed in bold, like it was trying to scare her. Derek finally said it out loud. "Honestly, Miss Evelyn, maybe this place just isn't for you anymore." That sentence hung in the air. Heavy, disrespectful, final. Miss Evelyn looked up at him then. Really looked, took him in. The smirk, the posture, the way he thought power came with the job title. She smiled politely, thanked him for his time, and walked out slow, same way she always did. But that night, something changed. She sat at her kitchen table under the yellow light, opened a drawer most people forgot existed. Inside were notebooks. Old ones, labeled, dated, organized. Every bill she'd ever paid. Every letter she'd ever received. Miss Evelyn didn't forget things. She archived them. She wrote one new line that night. "Derek, property manager, first lie." She closed the notebook, took a sip of tea. Calm as ever. Because Miss Evelyn wasn't confused. She wasn't scared. She was activated. And Derek had no idea that the quiet old lady he'd just brushed off had officially started his payback file. The next morning, Miss Evelyn woke up the same way she always did, 5:47 a.m. No alarm, no rush. She made her oatmeal plain, stirred it slow, and listened to the building wake up. Doors slamming, kids running, someone yelling on the phone. Chaos. She moved through it like a ghost. By 9 a.m., Derek was already on his third coffee, and his first lie of the day. He told another tenant the late fees were automatic. Told someone else the system must have glitched. Same excuse. Different face. He liked that power, that little moment where people doubted themselves instead of him. What he didn't know was that Miss Evelyn had already made her first move. She didn't call Derek. She didn't email management. She called City Housing Compliance. Not angry, not dramatic, just polite. Clear, precise. "Hi, sweetheart," she said, voice warm as Sunday. "I just had a question about tenant payment records and late fee assessments." The woman on the line asked for dates. Miss Evelyn gave them. Asked for receipts. Miss Evelyn had copies. Asked if she could email them over. Miss Evelyn already had the scanner warming up. By noon, a file was opened. By 3 p.m., Derek got an email, flagged urgent. He skimmed it. Scoffed, rolled his eyes. "Old lady must be confused," he muttered, leaning back in his chair like he had time to spare. That evening, Miss Evelyn ran into Tanya from 3B by the mailboxes. Single mom. 2 jobs, always tired, always polite. "They put a late notice on my door," Tanya whispered. "I paid already." Miss Evelyn nodded slowly. "Did you keep your receipt?" Tanya shook her head. "Didn't think I'd need it." Miss Evelyn reached into her purse and pulled out a small yellow sticky note. Wrote a number on it. "Next time," she said gently, "call this office and start writing things down." Tanya looked confused. Why? Miss Evelyn smiled. Because patterns matter, baby. That night, Miss Evelyn added another line to her notebook. Multiple tenants affected. Same method, she didn't sleep angry. She slept focused. Meanwhile, Derek stayed late, tapping away at his computer, clearing browser tabs like bad habits. He didn't notice the complaint log growing. Didn't notice the internal audit request quietly moving up the chain. He definitely didn't notice the city inspector's name attached to the case. Because Derek thought power came from titles. Miss Evelyn knew it came from paper trails. And while Derek was still calling her just another old tenant, Miss Evelyn was turning his little game into a documented problem. The kind that doesn't go away. The kind that ends careers. This was still calm, still quiet. But the walls were starting to close in. By the end of the week, the building felt different. Not louder, not quieter, just tense. Like everyone could sense something shifting under their feet. Miss Evelyn noticed it first in the elevator. The way people stopped complaining mid-cadence. The way Derek's name started getting whispered instead of said out loud. She pressed the button for her floor, stood straight, and said nothing. Silence had always been her favorite weapon. Derek got the notice on a Friday afternoon. City housing compliance. Scheduled inspection. Full records requested. Payment logs. Fee justifications. Tenant correspondence. His smile vanished the second he finished reading. He leaned back in his chair, ran a hand through his hair, and laughed once sharp, nervous. This is nothing, he said to no one. But he printed the email anyway. Printed things always felt more real. That night, Miss Evelyn reorganized her notebook. Not because it was messy, because it was growing. She added dates, cross-referenced names, highlighted patterns. Late fees applied only to certain tenants. Online payments lost when they came from older residents. In-person receipts ignored. She didn't assume, she confirmed. Assumptions make people sloppy. Miss Evelyn never was. Saturday morning, Derek knocked on her door. First time ever. He stood there with that same fake friendly posture, hands clasped, voice softened like syrup. Miss Evelyn, he said, I just wanted to check in. Make sure you're doing okay. She looked at him through the screen door. Took her time. I'm doing just fine. He nodded too fast. Good, good. About those fees we might have had a misunderstanding. She tilted her head. Did we? Derek chuckled. Well, you know how systems are. Miss Evelyn smiled politely. I trust systems. That's why I keep records. Something flickered behind his eyes. He cleared his throat, wished her a good day, and left quicker than he arrived. Miss Evelyn watched him walk down the hallway, shoulders tight, steps rushed. Fear makes people careless. She made a note of that too. By Monday, flyers went up announcing the inspection. Tenants started asking questions. Derek stopped making eye contact. His emails got shorter, his tone sharper. He was losing control, and he could feel it. What he couldn't feel was the calm sitting right across from him every time Miss Evelyn passed the office door. She wasn't excited, she wasn't nervous, she was patient. Because she knew something Derek didn't. Once paperwork reaches the city, it doesn't come back clean, it comes back thorough. And somewhere in a filing system downtown, a folder already existed with his name on it. Miss Evelyn poured her tea that evening and whispered, almost amused, still early. This wasn't the fall yet. This was the stumble before it. Inspection day arrived, wrapped in fake calm. The kind that looks normal until you pay attention. 2 city inspectors walked in just after 9, clipboards in hand, faces unreadable. Derek stood up too fast, chair scraping the floor, smile glued on like it might fall off if he relaxed. He talked more than he needed to, over-explained things nobody asked about. Miss Evelyn watched from the hallway bench, hands folded in her lap, eyes lowered, listening to every word. The inspectors asked for payment logs. Derek fumbled with folders. Asked for late fee justifications. He hesitated, asked for tenant communication records. His voice tightened. The room felt smaller with every question. Miss Evelyn could almost hear the clock ticking inside his chest. When one inspector mentioned multiple complaints with identical timelines, Derek laughed again. Too loud, too quick. That laugh did him no favors. They moved floor by floor, unit by unit. Miss Evelyn opened her door when they knocked, smiling gently, offering water, handing over copies already labeled and stapled, dates, signatures, proof. One inspector raised an eyebrow, impressed despite himself. "You keep good records," he said. Miss Evelyn nodded. "I was raised that way." By lunchtime, Derek was sweating through his collar. Tenants whispered in clusters. Phones came out. Stories lined up. Patterns clicked. What looked like confusion started to look like design. Miss Evelyn sat back down on the bench, quiet as ever, while her paper trail did the talking she never needed to do. That afternoon, Derek pulled Tanya aside. His voice dropped, sharp and desperate. "Did you file a complaint?" Tanya shook her head, eyes wide. He asked 2 more tenants. Same answer. His gaze drifted down the hallway and landed, finally, on Miss Evelyn. She was reading a pamphlet like none of this concerned her. Like she hadn't built the whole thing brick by brick. The inspectors left just before 5. No smiles. No reassurances. Just a firm handshake and a promise to follow up. Derek closed the office door and stayed inside longer than usual. When he finally came out, his face looked smaller, thinner. The confidence had leaked out somewhere between question number 3 and receipt number 12. Miss Evelyn went home and wrote one line in her notebook. Inspection completed. Discrepancies confirmed. She closed it, set it back in the drawer, and turned off the light. Because now the system was awake. And systems don't forget. The follow-up didn't come with sirens or shouting. It came with emails, certified letters, and calendar invites Derek couldn't ignore. Requests for clarification. Requests for corrections. Requests for explanations that had to match the paper trail he didn't have. Every message tightened the room around him. He started staying late again, deleting nothing, rewriting everything, hoping words could fix what numbers had already exposed. Miss Evelyn felt the shift before she saw it. Late fees stopped appearing on doors. Notices got quieter. Derek's tone softened overnight, like a man trying to walk back footprints already set in wet cement. He even sent a building-wide email about temporary adjustments and administrative review. Miss Evelyn read it twice, folded it neatly, and filed it under the date. Temporary was a word people used when they were scared of permanent. One afternoon, Derek caught her in the hallway. He tried kindness this time, asked about her health, asked if she needed help setting up online payments. His voice cracked just a little on the word help. Miss Evelyn smiled the same polite smile she always wore and said, "No thank you. I'm comfortable with the way things are." That answer followed him all day. Tenants started coming to her now. Not loudly. Not officially. Just quiet questions by the stairs. Miss Evelyn never told them what to do. She only told them what to keep. Receipts, dates, names. She watched confidence return to people who had been shrinking for months. Power doesn't always look like control. Sometimes it looks like memory. Then the second letter arrived. This one wasn't about records. It was about reimbursement, improper fees, potential violations. Derek read it standing up, then sitting down, then standing again. His hands shook as he counted the number of units affected, counted the months, counted the zeros at the end. The math didn't like him. Miss Evelyn added another line to her notebook. Restitution phase initiated. That evening, Derek knocked on her door again. Longer this time. Harder. When she opened it, he looked smaller than she remembered, less sharp, less sure. "I think we need to talk," he said. Miss Evelyn met his eyes, calm and steady. "I think we already have," she replied. And for the first time since he took that job, Derek realized something chilling. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a complaint. This was accountability, and it had found him. Derek didn't sleep that night. He lay awake replaying conversations, emails, hallway looks. By morning, fear had turned into something uglier, Defensiveness. People don't always confess when cornered. Some of them swing. By 10 a.m., he'd convinced himself this mess had a single source, and he was done pretending he didn't know where it came from. He started pulling files. Old ones. Tenants who paid in person. Tenants who didn't complain. Tenants who did. Miss Evelyn's name came up more than once. Always clean. Always consistent. That consistency irritated him. He told himself she was manipulating things. Using age as a shield. Playing innocent. The story he built made it easier to act. That afternoon, a notice appeared on her door. Not an eviction. Something smaller, petty. A warning about unauthorized storage on her balcony. A rule nobody enforced. A rule he knew wouldn't stick. But rules don't need to win, they just need to intimidate. Miss Evelyn read it twice. Then once more. She didn't tear it down. She didn't march to the office. She folded it carefully and placed it in the same drawer as the rest. Her hand didn't shake. Her breath didn't change. Retaliation was loud. She stayed quiet. The next day, Derek escalated. Maintenance skipped her unit. Trash pickup missed her floor. Little inconveniences, stacked just enough to feel intentional. Tenants noticed. So did the inspectors, when a new complaint came in describing selective enforcement. Same dates, same handwriting style, different tenant names. Miss Evelyn sat with Tanya that evening, listening while the younger woman vented. She nodded, offered tea, and said one sentence. When people panic, they reveal themselves. That night, Miss Evelyn wrote again. Retaliation observed. Pattern consistent. Derek didn't realize it yet, but his reckless move had done something powerful. It shifted the story. What started as a billing issue was now about abuse of authority, about targeting, about intent. The kind of words that don't wash off with apologies. By Friday, another calendar invite hit his inbox. Expanded review. Additional witnesses. Compliance officer present. Derek stared at the screen and felt the floor tilt. Miss Evelyn turned off her lamp, lay back in bed, and closed her eyes peacefully. Because once someone starts digging their own hole, the smartest thing you can do is let them keep digging. By the time the compliance officer showed up, Derek had switched strategies. No more intimidation. No more pressure. Now it was damage control. He printed new policies, highlighted sections, used words like oversight and miscommunication like they were bandages. He even brought donuts to the office, as if sugar could soften the truth. Miss Evelyn arrived early and took the same seat she always did. She watched Derek perform concern for an audience that had already read the script. He spoke carefully, trying to sound transparent without admitting anything. The compliance officer listened without reacting, pen moving steadily across the page. No nods, no interruptions. Just quiet note-taking, the kind that makes people nervous. When it was Miss Evelyn's turn to speak, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse. She didn't speculate. She stated facts, dates, receipts, timelines. She explained how rules were applied unevenly, how communication shifted once questions were asked, how retaliation followed scrutiny. Her words were simple, clean, impossible to twist. Derek tried to interrupt. The compliance officer held up a hand. Let her finish. Miss Evelyn finished. Then Tanya spoke. Then another tenant. Then another. Different stories, same pattern. Derek's explanations started contradicting each other. He blamed software, then staff, then training gaps. Each excuse landed weaker than the last. He was building his own maze and getting lost in it. At one point, the compliance officer asked Derek why certain tenants were flagged while others weren't. Derek opened his mouth, closed it, looked down at his notes like the answer might appear if he stared hard enough. It didn't. Miss Evelyn watched him shrink behind the desk, his authority folding in on itself. She felt no joy, no anger, just relief. Truth has a way of steadying the room. The meeting ended without resolution. That alone said everything. The compliance officer collected documents, thanked everyone, and said the review would continue. No timeline, No promises. Just process. Afterward, Derek tried one last time. He caught Miss Evelyn near the exit. Lowered his voice. You know this is getting out of hand. She met his eyes, calm as ever. I know, she said. That's what happens when things go on too long. That night, Miss Evelyn didn't write anything new. She didn't need to. The story was writing itself now. And Derek was officially out of words. By the time the compliance officer showed up, Derek had switched strategies. No more intimidation. No more pressure. Now it was damage control. He printed new policies. Highlighted sections. Used words like oversight and miscommunication like they were bandages. He even brought donuts to the office, as if sugar could soften the truth. Miss Evelyn arrived early and took the same seat she always did. She watched Derek perform concern for an audience that had already read the script. He spoke carefully, trying to sound transparent without admitting anything. The compliance officer listened without reacting, pen moving steadily across the page. No nods, no interruptions. Just quiet note-taking, the kind that makes people nervous. When it was Miss Evelyn's turn to speak, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse, she didn't speculate. She stated facts, dates, receipts. She explained how rules were applied unevenly. How communication shifted once questions were asked. How retaliation followed scrutiny. Her words were simple, clean, impossible to twist. Derek tried to interrupt. The compliance officer held up a hand. Let her finish. Miss Evelyn finished. Then Tanya spoke. Then another tenant. Then another. Different stories. Same pattern. Derek's explanations started contradicting each other. He blamed software, then staff, then training gaps. Each excuse landed weaker than the last. He was building his own maze and getting lost in it. At one point, the compliance officer asked Derek why certain tenants were flagged while others weren't. Derek opened his mouth, closed it, looked down at his notes like the answer might appear if he stared hard enough. It didn't. Miss Evelyn watched him shrink behind the desk, his authority folding in on itself. She felt no joy, no anger, just relief. Truth has a way of steadying the room. The meeting ended without resolution. That alone said everything. The compliance officer collected documents, thanked everyone, and said the review would continue. No timeline, no promises. Just process. Afterward, Derek tried one last time. He caught Miss Evelyn near the exit, lowered his voice. You know this is getting out of hand. She met his eyes, calm as ever. I know, she said. That's what happens when things go on too long. That night, Miss Evelyn didn't write anything new. She didn't need to. The story was writing itself now. And Derek was officially out of words. The email didn't come from Derek this time. It came from regional management. Polite subject line. Serious tone. Mandatory review. Derek read it twice, then a third time slower, like reading it differently might change what it said. It didn't. They wanted records. They wanted interviews. They wanted answers he couldn't improvise. Miss Evelyn noticed the new faces before the announcement went up. Two unfamiliar men in the hallway, suits that didn't belong to the building, voices low and clipped. They didn't smile at Derek. They didn't joke. They walked straight past his office and started asking questions upstairs. That was new. Derek stopped using the word temporary. He started using pending review, pending guidance, pending outcome. Words people use when they're waiting for permission to breathe. He stayed late again, lights on long after the building went quiet. He stopped knocking on doors. Stopped making announcements. Power had retreated into silence. Miss Evelyn was called in on a Tuesday afternoon. Different room, different tone. Regional management listened carefully, asked follow-up questions, and thanked her more than once. Not for complaining, but for being thorough. One of them said, "Most people don't keep records like this." Miss Evelyn smiled. Most people don't expect to be tested. By midweek, Derek wasn't at his desk as much. His door stayed closed. When it opened, his posture had changed, Shoulders slumped, voice careful, movements restrained. He was being watched now. He could feel it. Everyone could. Tenants stopped whispering. They started waiting. Waiting has a sound when enough people do it at once. Miss Evelyn felt it in the elevator, in the stairwell, in the way people stood a little taller when Derek passed by. Thursday evening, a notice went up in the lobby. Interim management procedures. Direct contact numbers. A reminder about tenant rights. Derek's name wasn't on it. Miss Evelyn paused in front of the paper and read it slowly. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She folded her hands and nodded once. Because this wasn't about winning. This was about correction. And Derek was starting to understand something heavy and unavoidable. When systems move in, they don't ask permission from the people who broke them. Derek came back on Friday like nothing was wrong. Same suit, same cologne, same forced confidence. But everyone could see the cracks now. He spoke slower, chose his words like they might be used against him because they could. Because they were. He started with apologies, not real ones, strategic ones. If anyone felt confused, if communication wasn't clear, if processes changed too fast, he never said I. Never said wrong. Miss Evelyn noticed that too. Accountability always starts with ownership. Derek was still renting his. By noon, he pulled Miss Evelyn into the office. Closed the door gently this time. Offered her a seat. She stayed standing. I think we can resolve this, he said. No more escalation. No more outside involvement. Miss Evelyn tilted her head slightly. Outside involvement is already here. Derek was asked to provide a written response. He spent hours on it, choosing words like a man picking stepping stones across deep water. He admitted nothing outright. Took responsibility for tone, for timing, for oversight. He blamed training gaps, workload, unclear directives. He didn't blame Miss Evelyn by name this time. He'd learned that lesson too late. The interim manager moved fast. Late fees were reversed. Refund checks were issued. Notices were pulled down and replaced with apologies signed by people Derek had never met. Tenants lined up at the office, quieter than expected, dignity returning with each corrected line item. Miss Evelyn watched from a distance, letting the process finish what she'd started. One afternoon, the compliance officer stopped her in the hallway. You understand, she said. This would have gone very differently without your records. Miss Evelyn smiled softly. That's why I keep them. Derek started packing his desk before anyone told him to. Not all at once, just a folder one day, a plant the next. He avoided the elevator, took the stairs, stopped making eye contact. His world had shrunk to a cardboard box and unanswered emails. On Friday, a final notice went up. Management restructuring. Staff changes effective immediately. Derek's name wasn't there at all. Miss Evelyn read it once and walked away. Because the loud part was over. What remained was the truth, filed and finalized. And truth, once written down, doesn't need anyone to defend it. Derek swallowed. You don't want this dragging on. She met his eyes. I didn't start it. He leaned forward. Lowered his voice. People are saying you're organizing tenants. Miss Evelyn smiled just enough to show she wasn't intimidated. People say many things when they're nervous. That smile did something to him. He stiffened. His patience snapped. You know, he said, regional management doesn't like troublemakers. Miss Evelyn's expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes sharpened. Neither does the city, she replied. Derek stood up to fast. This conversation is over. She nodded. It is. An hour later, he made his mistake. He sent an email, building-wide addressed concerns. Framed the situation as misinformation spread by a single source. No names. Just enough implication to poison the room. He thought it was clever. Thought he'd isolate the problem. Thought fear would do what authority no longer could. Instead, it backfired. By evening, 3 tenants forwarded that email to compliance. Another sent it to regional management. A 4th printed it and added it to an existing complaint. Retaliation, intimidation, narrative manipulation. All in writing. Miss Evelyn read the email once, printed it, filed it. Then she wrote one final note for the day. Direct evidence of bad faith. Derek went home that night believing he'd regained control. Miss Evelyn went to bed knowing he'd just handed them the last piece. Because when someone tells on themselves, the smartest thing you can do is let them finish. Monday morning didn't ease and it hit. Derek walked into the office to find 2 chairs already occupied, regional management on one side, compliance on the other. No donuts this time. No small talk. Just folders laid out like evidence at a trial. He stood there for a second too long before sitting, and that pause told them everything they needed to know. They started with the email. The one he thought was vague enough to protect him. It wasn't. They asked why a single source was mentioned during an active review. Asked why tenant communication was being framed as misinformation. Asked why his language shifted right after oversight intensified. Derek tried to explain. His explanations contradicted last week's explanations. The folders didn't argue back. They didn't need to. Miss Evelyn wasn't in the room, but her presence was everywhere. Receipts, notes, timelines. Her handwriting appeared again and again, steady and consistent, like a heartbeat running through the file. One manager tapped the page and said, "This level of documentation changes things." By noon, Derek's access was limited. Systems temporarily locked. Authority paused. They used careful words, but the meaning was clear. Step back. Sit tight. Don't touch anything. The job he once strutted through now felt borrowed. Word traveled fast. Tenants noticed the locked office door. Noticed Derek sitting in the lobby instead of behind the desk. Noticed how people spoke to him differently, now polite but distant. Power had officially changed hands, and everyone could feel it. Miss Evelyn passed through the lobby that afternoon, cane tapping softly. Derek looked up, eyes tired, searching her face for something: anger, satisfaction, mercy. She gave him none of it. Just a calm nod and kept walking. That night, regional management sent another notice. Interim manager appointed. Review ongoing. Cooperation expected. Derek's name appeared only once, buried in formal language. Miss Evelyn sat at her kitchen table, the notebook open but untouched. There was nothing left to add. The system had taken over. Her work was done. And somewhere between losing access and losing authority, Derek finally understood the part he'd missed from the start. You don't need to fight someone like Miss Evelyn, you just need to leave them alone. The findings didn't arrive all at once. They never do. They came in layers: quiet, formal, impossible to argue with. Regional management called it a preliminary determination. Compliance called it substantiated. Concerns. Miss Evelyn called it exactly what it was: confirmation. Derek was asked to provide a written response. He spent hours on it, choosing words like a man picking stepping stones across deep water. He admitted nothing outright. Took responsibility for tone, for timing, for oversight. He blamed training gaps, workload, unclear directives. He didn't blame Miss Evelyn by name this time. He'd learned that lesson too late. The interim manager moved fast. Late fees were reversed. Refund checks were issued. Notices were pulled down and replaced with apologies signed by people Derek had never met. Tenants lined up at the office, quieter than expected, dignity returning with each corrected line item. Miss Evelyn watched from a distance, letting the process finish what she'd started. One afternoon, the compliance officer stopped her in the hallway. "You understand," she said, "this would have gone very differently without your records." Miss Evelyn smiled softly. "That's why I keep them." Derek started packing his desk before anyone told him to. Not all at once, just a folder one day, a plant the next. He avoided the elevator, took the stairs, stopped making eye contact. His world had shrunk to a cardboard box and unanswered emails. On Friday, a final notice went up: management restructuring. Staff changes effective immediately. Derek's name wasn't there at all. Miss Evelyn read it once and walked away. Because the loud part was over. What remained was the truth, filed and finalized. And truth, once written down, doesn't need anyone to defend it. Derek's last day didn't come with an announcement. No farewell email. No handshake tours. He showed up early, boxed up the rest of his things, and left before most people noticed. By the time tenants started arriving, his office was empty, the nameplate already gone like he'd never been there at all. The interim manager gathered a few residents in the lobby later that morning. She spoke plainly, apologized clearly, explained changes without hiding behind language. Miss Evelyn listened from the edge of the crowd, hands folded, face calm. This was how authority was supposed to sound: steady, accountable, present. A refund check arrived that afternoon. Miss Evelyn examined it carefully, then placed it in her notebook between two old receipts. Not because she needed proof anymore, but because habits don't disappear just because the problem does. Life in the building settled into something quieter. Maintenance showed up when called. Notices made sense. People stopped flinching when emails came through. Miss Evelyn noticed neighbors standing straighter, voices less hesitant. Stability does that to people. A week later, the compliance officer closed the case. Final findings issued. Corrective actions completed. No further follow-up required. Miss Evelyn read the letter slowly, folded it once, and placed it in the drawer with the others. The file was complete. That evening, she sat by the window and watched the sun slide behind the buildings across the street. No victory speech. No celebration. Just a deep, satisfied breath. Because revenge isn't always loud. Sometimes it looks like fairness restored. Sometimes it looks like a system finally doing its job. And sometimes, it looks like an old woman closing a notebook and moving on with her life. The building didn't just return to normal, it improved. New policies were posted. Office hours became consistent. Complaints were answered with timelines instead of excuses. It was subtle, but it mattered. Miss Evelyn noticed it in the small things: the way maintenance knocked twice before entering, the way notices used plain language, the way people stopped apologizing for asking questions. Word traveled beyond Maple Ridge. Tenants in nearby buildings mentioned similar changes. Different managers, same company. Same sudden emphasis on documentation and transparency. Miss Evelyn didn't take credit. She understood how systems learn: one problem surfaces, and the fix spreads outward. One afternoon, a young woman from another complex stopped her outside the grocery store, said she'd heard about the lady who kept records, said it helped her stand her ground. Miss Evelyn smiled and told her the same thing she'd told Tanya. Write it down, keep everything. At home, Miss Evelyn reorganized her drawer, removed old sticky notes, filed final letters. She labeled the folder one last time, not with a name, but with a date. Stories end better that way. She found herself sleeping easier. The tension she hadn't named had loosened its grip, not because she'd won but because she hadn't compromised herself to get there. Dignity intact. Boundaries respected. Sometimes she caught herself smiling at nothing in particular. Not joy, not pride, just peace. Because when you stand firm without becoming cruel, you don't just change outcomes. You change patterns. And Miss Evelyn had always believed that patterns were the only things worth fixing. Just when Miss Evelyn thought the chapter was closed, the phone rang. Unknown number. She almost let it go to voicemail. Old habits said pick up. Experience said listen first. She answered without speaking. A pause. Then a woman's voice, measured, professional, careful. She introduced herself as legal counsel for the property company. Said they were reviewing past practices. Said they appreciated Miss Evelyn's cooperation. Then she asked the question that always comes at the end of things like this. Would you be willing to provide a formal statement? Miss Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. Not tired, just weighing. Statements turn stories into records. Records live longer than people. She asked for the request in writing. It arrived within the hour. Miss Evelyn read it slowly, twice, then once more in silence. They weren't asking her to accuse. They were asking her to confirm. To lock the facts in place so they couldn't be undone later. She understood the difference. That night, She sat at her table longer than usual. Thought about Derek not with anger, but clarity. Thought about the tenants who came after her. Thought about how easily things slip back when no one's watching. In the end, she said yes. She spent the next morning preparing. Not emotionally, logistically, she gathered documents, organized timelines, numbered exhibits. When she finished, she felt that familiar calm, the kind that comes from being ready. The statement was signed and submitted without drama. No embellishment, no commentary. Just truth, clean and complete. A week later, another letter arrived. This one shorter. Thank you for your assistance. The review is now finalized. Miss Evelyn placed it in the drawer and closed it gently. She stood by the window afterward and realized something had changed. Not in the building. In herself. She wasn't bracing anymore. She wasn't waiting, because the hardest part of standing up is knowing when you're allowed to sit back down. And Miss Evelyn had earned that rest. Time passed the way it always does, quietly, without asking permission. Weeks turned into months. Seasons shifted. Miss Evelyn fell back into her routines, not out of habit, but comfort. Morning walks, afternoon tea. The slow satisfaction of knowing nothing was waiting to go wrong. One afternoon, a knock came at her door. Not sharp, not urgent, just polite. When she opened it, a young man stood there holding a clipboard, nerves written all over his face. He introduced himself as the new assistant manager. Said he was checking in with long-term tenants. Said he'd heard her name more than once. Only good things, he added quickly. Miss Evelyn smiled and invited him to sit. She listened while he explained new procedures, tenant councils, feedback loops. Words Derek had never used. When he finished, she nodded and asked one question. How long will you be here? He hesitated. As long as I do the job right. That's a good answer, she said. Later that week, Tanya stopped by with her kids. They brought cookies. Store-bought, slightly burnt, but offered with pride. Tanya thanked Miss Evelyn without turning it into a speech. Just a quiet acknowledgement between two women who understood what it meant to survive pressure. Miss Evelyn watched the kids play in the living room and realized something unexpected. What she'd done hadn't ended with Derek. It had made space. Space for people to speak. Space for fairness to settle in. That night, she opened the drawer again, not to add anything, but to look. The notebook sat there, finished, complete. She ran her fingers over the cover and smiled. Some stories don't need sequels. They just need witnesses. And Miss Evelyn had become one without ever raising her voice. The test came quietly, dressed as a favor. The assistant manager called one afternoon, voice hesitant, respectful. He explained there was a backlog of maintenance requests and asked if Miss Evelyn would mind waiting a little longer than others. You're always so understanding, he said, almost apologetic. Miss Evelyn didn't answer right away. She looked at the calendar, looked at the notes she no longer kept. Then she smiled, not unkindly. I don't mind waiting, she said, as long as waiting is fair. The line went silent for a second. Then he cleared his throat and said he'd look into it. The next morning, maintenance knocked on her door first. Miss Evelyn watched the assistant manager from her window later that day. Clipboard tucked under his arm, correcting someone's schedule. He hadn't meant harm. But habits have a way of sneaking back when people think no one will notice. That evening, Miss Evelyn sat with her tea and thought about the difference between silence and surrender. One protects peace. The other invites trouble. She had learned when to use each. A few days later, she was invited to the first tenant council meeting. She almost declined. Then she remembered how many times she'd wished someone older had spoken up when she was younger. She went. She didn't dominate the room. She didn't lecture. She asked one question about transparency, another about accountability. The assistant manager took notes like they mattered because they did. Walking home, Miss Evelyn felt something she hadn't expected, not responsibility, not burden, purpose, light and unforced, because being underestimated isn't an insult, it's an opportunity. And Miss Evelyn had learned how to use it without losing herself. Reputations don't spread with announcements. They move through side conversations, half-finished sentences, the way people lower their voices when they say a name. Miss Evelyn started noticing it at the tenant council meetings, how new faces glanced at her before speaking, how questions seemed to circle her side of the room before landing. Then came Marla from the 4th floor. Marla was loud where Miss Evelyn was quiet, sharp where Miss Evelyn was soft. She complained often, publicly, and with confidence. When she didn't get what she wanted, a parking adjustment, a fee reversal she hadn't earned, she started pointing fingers. Not at management. At Miss Evelyn. "She's the reason everything's so strict now," Marla said one afternoon, loud enough for the hallway to hear. "People can't even bend the rules anymore." Miss Evelyn paused at her door, turned slowly, looked at Marla not with irritation, but curiosity. "Rules aren't meant to bend," she said calmly. "They're meant to hold." Marla scoffed. "Easy for you to say. You're protected." Miss Evelyn smiled. "Just a little. No one is protected from paperwork." That night, a complaint landed in the office. Anonymous, vague, suggesting Miss Evelyn was over-involved and influencing management decisions. The assistant manager frowned when he read it. He recognized the tone. He recognized the timing. He did not recognize the facts. Miss Evelyn was informed politely, transparently. He asked if she'd like to respond. She nodded. Of course. Her response was short. Dates, meetings, attended, statements made. No demands. No instructions. Just participation. Observed, documented, clean. By the end of the week, Marla's complaints shifted targets. Management, parking noise, anything else. The system absorbed them calmly and moved on. Miss Evelyn never mentioned it again. Because when people test boundaries out of frustration, the strongest response is consistency. And Miss Evelyn had mastered that long before anyone noticed. The offer came folded inside an envelope with the building's letterhead, slid under Miss Evelyn's door like any other notice. She almost ignored it. Almost. Habit made her open it. Experience made her read it twice. They were forming a resident advisory role, voluntary, unpaid. Quarterly meetings with regional management, a chance to provide perspective. The language was careful, respectful, just vague enough to feel safe. Miss Evelyn understood what it really meant. They wanted a conscience in the room. Someone who noticed things early. Someone who didn't flinch. She set the letter down and stared out the window for a long time. Influence sounds flattering until you remember it comes with responsibility. Comfort had taken her years to earn. She wasn't eager to give it back. That evening, she walked the hallway and listened. A door slammed somewhere. A child laughed. Someone argued softly on the phone. Life, continuing. She realized then that the peace she enjoyed wasn't accidental, it was maintained by people paying attention. At the next tenant council meeting, the assistant manager mentioned the advisory role, almost casually. "No pressure," he said. "Just an option." Miss Evelyn raised her hand. The room quieted without anyone asking it to. "I'll do it," she said. "As long as it stays transparent." Relief crossed his face before he could hide it. The first meeting was uneventful. That was the point. Updates, metrics, plans. Miss Evelyn listened more than she spoke. When she did speak, it was precise. Questions about timelines, about escalation paths, about how decisions would be recorded. Afterward, one of the regional managers thanked her. "You have a way of seeing things before they become problems." Miss Evelyn smiled. Problems don't appear suddenly. People just stop noticing. Walking home, she felt the weight settle, not heavy, just present. She hadn't chosen power. She'd chosen watchfulness, because comfort is nice. But influence, used gently, keeps comfort from disappearing. The pattern showed up in a spreadsheet. Not obvious, not dramatic. Just a column that didn't quite line up with the others. Miss Evelyn noticed it during a quarterly review call, her eyes drifting where no one else's did. A new fee category. Small amounts. Rolled out quietly across multiple properties. Framed as administrative adjustment. She didn't react, she asked a question instead. What triggers this fee? The regional manager answered smoothly. System-based, automatically applied. Miss Evelyn nodded. And how does the system decide? A pause, not long, just enough. They promised to follow up. By the next meeting, she had looked closer. Not hacked, not pried. Just read the materials they'd already shared. The fee appeared more often in buildings with older populations, less often where tenants paid online. It wasn't malicious yet, but it was drifting. Drift is how problems are born. She raised it again, gently, asked for a pilot review, suggested a hold until criteria were clarified. The room shifted. Some faces tightened, others relaxed. Someone said, "It's minor." Miss Evelyn replied, "Minor things grow when they're ignored." The fee was paused. A review was ordered. No drama, no headlines, just prevention. After the call, a regional director emailed her privately, thanked her, said the issue might have gone unnoticed for months. Miss Evelyn closed the message and poured her tea. She thought about Derek not with resentment, but as a lesson. Systems don't turn cruel overnight. They slide there, one unchecked choice at a time. That evening, she walked past the office and saw the assistant manager training a new hire, explaining processes carefully, emphasizing documentation. Miss Evelyn smiled to herself. Because the real victory isn't stopping one wrong thing. It's changing how people notice the next one. The thing about influence is you don't always feel it when it's at its strongest. Miss Evelyn realized that during a meeting where no one interrupted her, no one argued, and no one needed convincing. Questions were answered before she asked them. Data was clearer. Decisions came with footnotes. The system had learned her language. That was when she knew it was time to slow down. She declined the next invitation politely. Not permanently, just enough. Said she'd review notes instead of attending live. Suggested others rotate in. Fresh eyes mattered. Everyone agreed too quickly. That told her she'd made the right call. Back at Maple Ridge, life stayed steady. Repairs were timely. Notices were plain. The building felt lighter, like a place that wasn't bracing anymore. Miss Evelyn walked the halls unnoticed again, which suited her just fine. One afternoon, the assistant manager asked if she'd mentor a new tenant council rep. Miss Evelyn smiled and said yes, but only once. They sat at her kitchen table, tea steaming, and Miss Evelyn said the same thing she always did. Write it down. Ask why. Stay kind. That night, she opened the drawer one last time. The notebook was still there, spine worn, pages full. She didn't add anything. She didn't need to. She closed the drawer and left it closed. Because some chapters end not with applause, but with balance restored. And Miss Evelyn had finally reached hers. Years passed the way they do when life is finally allowed to be simple. Miss Evelyn's hair went whiter. Her steps slowed just a touch. The building changed hands twice, each transition smoother than the last. Systems held. Records stayed clean. Problems surfaced early and were fixed before they grew teeth. New tenants came and went, most of them never knowing her story. To them, she was just the woman who smiled in the hallway and kept to herself. That was fine. Stories don't need audiences to be true. Every now and then, someone new on the tenant council would mention the standards like they'd always existed. The documentation. The transparency. The way concerns were handled without drama. Miss Evelyn would listen quietly, tea in hand, and say nothing. Standards are strongest when people forget who set them. One spring afternoon, she watched a young mother argue calmly with management about a billing errand win. No fear. No raised voices. Just facts. Miss Evelyn felt something warm settle in her chest. Not pride. Continuity. She wrote a letter that night. Not a complaint. Not a report. A note of thanks to the assistant manager, now a regional lead. She told him the building felt fair. That was all. He wrote back and called it the best review he'd ever received. Miss Evelyn folded the letter, placed it in the drawer, and closed it for good. Because legacy isn't about being remembered. It's about making things better for people you'll never meet. And she had done that quietly, completely. Say next for part 22, where Miss Evelyn faces her final decision about what comes after all of this. Here's part 22 of 25, paragraph only, gentle and reflective. The decision arrived without urgency, which is how the important ones usually do. Miss Evelyn received a letter offering a move to a smaller unit, same building, better light, fewer stairs. It made sense. Practical. Sensible. The kind of choice people assume is easy. She didn't answer right away. She walked through her apartment slowly, touching the edges of things that had held her life. The kitchen table where she'd organized receipts. The drawer that had once been full of proof. The window where she'd watched the city settle after long days. Rooms remember more than people realize. That night, she dreamed of her younger self working, waiting, learning when to speak and when to stay still. She woke with clarity, not sadness. She accepted the move. Neighbors helped pack. Someone labeled boxes carefully, like it mattered. Miss Evelyn smiled and let them. On moving day, she stood in the empty living room one last time and whispered thank you not to the walls, but to the lessons learned inside them. The new apartment felt lighter, brighter, a place for rest instead of readiness. Miss Evelyn placed her tea set by the window and left the drawer empty. Some tools don't need to be unpacked, because chapters close best when you don't carry the weight forward. And Miss Evelyn was ready for what came next. The echo came on a rainy afternoon, years after Derek's name had faded from memory. A knock at Miss Evelyn's door, hesitant but hopeful. When she opened it, a woman stood there holding a folder, rain on her coat, nerves in her eyes. She introduced herself as a tenant from another complex across town, said she'd been given Miss Evelyn's name by someone who said, "If anyone knows how to handle this the right way, she will." The woman explained a familiar story, fees that didn't make sense, emails that went unanswered, a manager who spoke in circles. Miss Evelyn listened without interrupting. She didn't sigh. She didn't reach for a notebook. When the woman finished, Miss Evelyn said only 3 things. Keep your receipts. Write down dates. Ask questions in writing. The woman blinked. That's it. Miss Evelyn smiled. That's enough. After she left, Miss Evelyn sat by the window and watched the rain blur the street. She realized something quietly profound. She hadn't passed on anger. She'd passed on method. That night, she didn't open any drawers. She didn't write anything down. She poured her tea and let the day close. Because influence that teaches people how to stand doesn't need to stay involved. And Miss Evelyn had finally learned how to let go completely. Life slowed in the best possible way. Miss Evelyn's days filled with small, steady pleasures, morning light through clean windows, the sound of distant traffic softened by rain, the comfort of knowing nothing needed fixing. She stopped checking notices automatically, stopped listening for problems in the walls. Peace had taken root. She spent more time outside. Park benches, short walks, quiet conversations with strangers that never went anywhere and didn't need to. She became lighter in her own body, less alert, more present. One evening, she sat with her tea and realized she hadn't thought about Derek in years. Not because she was avoiding the memory, but because it no longer mattered. That surprised her more than it should have. She found herself laughing softly at a TV show, something she used to watch half distracted while organizing paperwork. Now she watched just to watch. That felt like progress. Miss Evelyn slept deeply that night. The kind of sleep that comes when your mind isn't standing guard anymore. Because the truest form of revenge isn't seeing someone fall. It's living so well afterward that the past can't reach you anymore. The call came late afternoon, when Miss Evelyn was halfway through folding laundry. Unknown number. She almost ignored it. Then she answered, because habits like hers didn't disappear overnight. The voice on the other end was calm, official, and unfamiliar. A compliance consultant. Independent. Brought in after Derek's removal to audit multiple properties under the same company. The woman explained that Miss Evelyn's file, her documentation, had been used as a reference case. Then came the question. "We've noticed similar patterns elsewhere," the woman said. "Would you be willing to speak?" Generally, Miss Evelyn sat down slowly. Not because she was tired, but because she understood the weight of that word generally. It meant her story wasn't over. It meant the problem wasn't just one man. It meant the quiet things she'd noticed weren't isolated. She didn't answer right away. Across the room, sunlight hit the drawer she no longer opened. "I don't give interviews," Miss Evelyn said finally. "We weren't asking for one," the woman replied. "Just guidance." Miss Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. Guidance was different. Guidance didn't chase, it corrected. She agreed on one condition. "No names," she said. "No stories. Just process." That night, Miss Evelyn lay awake longer than usual. Not anxious, alert, because there was a difference between finishing something and realizing it had grown bigger than you expected. And somewhere, in another building, another Derek was probably getting comfortable. That thought didn't anger her. It focused her. Miss Evelyn treated the call like a meeting, not a favor. She prepared the same way she always had, quietly, thoroughly, without drama. She didn't gather old notebooks. She didn't reopen the drawer. She wrote fresh notes on clean paper. New context, new scope, old habits, sharpened. The consultant didn't ask about Derek. That surprised her. Instead, she asked about warning signs. Small shifts, language changes. How power announced itself before it abused itself. Miss Evelyn answered plainly. She talked about tone, about selective enforcement, about how systems drift when no one's paying attention. She never raised her voice. She never moralized. She explained. When the call ended, Miss Evelyn felt something she hadn't in a long time. Not adrenaline, not fear. Responsibility. The quiet kind that settles instead of spikes. Weeks passed. The consultant emailed once, thanked her, said the guidance had already adjusted an audit framework. Miss Evelyn closed the message and went about her day. She didn't tell anyone. Influence didn't need witnesses. Then a letter arrived. Formal, heavy paper. The company was revising its tenant rights protocols across multiple regions, training modules, documentation standards, oversight layers, all inspired by recent findings. Miss Evelyn recognized her words buried in the phrasing. She folded the letter carefully and set it aside. That evening, she walked through the building and noticed how comfortable it felt. Not careless, comfortable. There's a difference. People laughed louder. Doors stayed open longer. The air didn't feel guarded anymore. She realized then that she'd crossed a line she couldn't uncross, not into conflict but into stewardship. She could step back again, but she couldn't unknow what she'd learned about how fragile fairness really was. Miss Evelyn poured her tea and whispered to the empty room, just once more. Because sometimes, you don't get to choose how far your stand travels, only how carefully you carry it. The new case didn't look like the old one. That was the point. The manager involved was careful, educated, polite in emails, every fee justified with policy language, every delay wrapped in procedure, no obvious lies, no paper missing, just a feeling thin, persistent that something wasn't right. Miss Evelyn recognized it immediately. This wasn't sloppiness. This was design. The consultant asked for her thoughts. Miss Evelyn didn't rush. She asked for one thing instead. "Show me who's confused," she said. They sent over anonymized notes. Tenants who didn't understand why decisions changed. Residents who stopped asking questions because answers took too long. People worn down, not pushed out. Miss Evelyn nodded to herself. Pressure doesn't always shout. Sometimes it waits people out. She advised, one move only. Measure response time. Track reversals. Compare outcomes by tenant profile, not name, not age, just behavior. Who asked questions? Who didn't? Patterns love quiet data. 2 weeks later, the pattern surfaced. Not discrimination. Not fraud. Something slippier. Strategic delay. Legal, clean, but uneven. The manager wasn't breaking rules. He was exhausting the people protected by them. Miss Evelyn felt no anger. Only respect for the skill and certainty about the fix. Time limits, she said. Force decisions into daylight. The consultant hesitated. That'll ruffle feathers. Miss Evelyn smiled faintly. Feathers grow back. Trust doesn't. The policy went into draft. Mandatory timelines, automatic escalation. Silence no longer counted as a response. The manager protested. Formally, politely, ineffectively. Miss Evelyn watched the process from a distance, hands steady, heart calm. The method still worked. Not because it punished, but because it removed hiding places. That night, she sat by the window longer than usual. Because the hardest truth she'd learned was this: the smarter the abuse, the calmer the response must be. The safeguards didn't arrive with applause, they arrived as updates. Bullet points, training slides, mandatory fields in software no one liked but everyone used. Miss Evelyn recognized the beauty in that. Quiet fixes last longer. The consultant sent one final summary. The new timelines were holding. Complaints dropped. Resolution rates rose. The smarter problem had been neutralized not by confrontation, but by clarity. Miss Evelyn closed the email and didn't respond. She spent the afternoon doing nothing important. Watered her plants. Walked a little slower than usual. Watched people pass by her window without wondering what they needed. That felt new. That felt earned. In the evening, she took out the drawer one last time. Not to add. Too empty. She sorted what mattered from what didn't. Kept the earliest notebook. Let the rest go. Memory didn't require evidence anymore. She realized then that vigilance has a season. Stay too long, and it hardens into suspicion. Leave at the right moment, and it becomes legacy. Miss Evelyn wrote a short note to the consultant, 2 sentences. Thank you, I'm stepping back. The reply came quickly. Understood, and thank you. She smiled and turned off the lamp. Because knowing when to stop is just as powerful as knowing when to begin. Letting go didn't happen all at once. It came in small moments. The first morning she didn't check her email. The afternoon she ignored a headline that once would have caught her eye. The quiet relief of realizing nothing needed her attention anymore. Miss Evelyn noticed how her body responded, shoulders lower, breathing slower. The constant readiness she'd carried for years finally loosened its grip. She hadn't realized how heavy it was until it left. One evening, she ran into Tanya by the mailbox, older, now steadier, confident in a way that didn't ask permission. They talked about ordinary things. Kids, work, weather. When they said goodbye, Tanya squeezed Miss Evelyn's hand and said, "You know, things changed because of you." Miss Evelyn smiled, warm but firm. Things changed because people stayed. That night, she dreamed without tension. No meetings, no folders, just movement and light and quiet spaces. When she woke, she felt complete, not accomplished, not proud, complete. She understood then that the role she'd played was never meant to be permanent. She had been a bridge, not a destination. A moment of balance, not the center of it. Miss Evelyn made her tea and sat by the window as the city moved on without her help, and for the first time, that felt exactly right. Miss Evelyn never told her story. She didn't need to. The proof lived in places that no longer felt tense, in rules that worked the same for everyone, in people who spoke up without fear because someone once showed them how. She stayed in her smaller apartment, sunlight warming the floor in the mornings, tea cooling at her side in the evenings. No notebooks. No drawers full of evidence. Just a life that finally belonged to itself. Somewhere else, another quiet person was being underestimated. Another system was drifting. Another small injustice was being written off as normal. Miss Evelyn knew how that story went now. She didn't smile about it. She didn't worry either, because power doesn't always look like control. Sometimes it looks like patience. Sometimes it looks like memory. And sometimes, it looks like knowing when to step in. And when to step away. She closed her eyes as the city lights came on, steady and sure. The truth didn't need her anymore. And that was the real victory. If this story made you think of someone who stayed quiet, someone who waited, someone who handled things the right way, drop A in the comments. And if you believe the most dangerous people are the calm ones, Subscribe to Payback Files because these stories aren't over.